Woo, there we go. Welcome to the crazy ride and technology. Much appreciated. This session is being recorded as an interview, just as FYI for everybody. I always like to record my interviews so I can go by and transcript them later. I find it easier than me trying to feverishly write all of the answers for every single question that we have. So Dr. Geller, thank you so much for joining us. It is such a pleasure and an honor to have you here today. And I'm just really excited that you've taken some time to share some thoughts with our audience.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
So this interview is going to be featured in a Forbes story on the Forbes Education channel. I want to make sure everybody understands. So we will be doing Q&A at the end of this interview, and then some of those Q&A answers, we may find ourselves working them into the article somehow. So we never know where exactly an interview is going to go, because I did not give a pre-script or pre-list of questions, as that's no fun. I think that interviews are generally a little better as a conversation. So Dr. Geller, maybe you could introduce yourself and tell us who you are, where you work, and maybe an interesting fact about yourself that we don't know.
Sure. So I'm Emma Geller. I'm an assistant teaching professor at University of California, San Diego. That's maybe a title people aren't familiar with, but basically what it means is that my primary job at UCSD is to teach undergrads. So in contrast to lots of other faculty there who are hired mostly to do research and bring in grant money, my job is really to focus on effective teaching for undergraduate students. And on the side, I also do some research. I'm trained in cognitive psychology, and I'm really interested in how we can apply what we know about cognitive psychology and learning and memory to improving teaching and instruction. And so a lot of the work that my lab does focuses on how to help students develop understanding in topics in math and science, and especially when that learning happens over video. So that's a little bit about me. Fun facts, I guess. My hobbies on the side include dancing. And so through grad school and when I moved to San Diego, I danced on a competitive hip hop team.
Whoa, nice.
Fun fact.
That's awesome. Oh, that's a great fun fact. I like it. You'll have to send us some video or something. That's awesome. Well, it's always nice to get to know somebody a little bit deeper than just what they do professionally, because we all have lives outside of what we do for work.
Mhm.
So you've done some work. Now, I know there hasn't been a lot of research done on the K-12 side of the fence with regards to virtual learning, but you have done some interesting work on just kind of trying to understand the cognitive side of virtual learning with post-secondary. Maybe you could share with us just some interesting things that you've discovered as you've been doing research just around learning in the virtual environment.
Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily say I've discovered things, but I can share with you sort of the basis of what I do. So there are many researchers that have come before me in this field who are interested in a question about how do we design multimedia learning to be effective. And multimedia has a really broad meaning here of just learning with words and pictures. And so it takes as a starting point an understanding of how does the brain process information. And it acknowledges that we generally, when we're learning, we use two different channels to get information into our heads, our eyes and our ears. And those channels have limited capacities, right? So you might know, for example, it's really hard to look at a picture and read at the same time, right? You have to do one of those two things because you just don't have the visual capacity to do them at the same time. And so this whole perspective on learning basically says we've got visual and auditory information. They are limited channels. And so effective teaching and learning is about managing what's happening in those channels. And there's some principles of effective design to make good use of these channels. And the research that I do is really trying to replicate those findings, but also understand what we would call boundary conditions. So some of the recommendations that have been made suggest things like, oh, well, it's a bad idea to have redundant text on screen if you also have narration. But some of the work we're doing now is trying to understand, like, well, in some cases that doesn't seem to be the case, right? Like that the idea here is like subtitles on a video, right? Sometimes subtitles actually might be really, really useful, and other times they might be distracting. And so part of the work we're trying to do is understand stuff like that.
Interesting.
including like when are animations helpful and when are they distracting? Does it always help to have a narrator on screen, or is a disembodied voice okay? What about chunking the video into smaller pieces so that rather than watching it all in one continuous go, you can sort of self-pace? So that's some of the stuff we do. And then sort of relatedly, I'm interested in the benefits of asking questions to help people learn. And so we do a lot of work with taking a video lesson and inserting interactive questions in the middle. And in general, doing that is good. Like asking questions helps people learn, but we're trying to understand other features of those. Like, is it better if they're in a multiple choice format or an open response format? Is it better to ask the questions at the beginning or the end or interspersed through the middle? And how much feedback do you need to give on people's answers to support learning? So we've done some work on this in lab studies, and I'm currently actually testing it in a class that I'm teaching this term.
Wow, that's awesome. So you're testing it live.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little bit messy, but that's how classroom research goes.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. It's interesting that you bring up the idea of the narrator on screen, and if that is potentially distracting, because I think of current K-12 environments where they're doing virtual learning,
Mhm.
and it is literally pretty much the teacher on the screen doing the teaching, but
Right.
that there may be certain areas. And have you seen any areas where that tends to not work as well, or has that yet to be figured out as to maybe where, whether that's by subject area or by other factors? Is there anything that you're saying like, man, we figured out that maybe in this case the narrator on screen isn't as beneficial?
Yeah, so having the narrator on screen is not something that my lab has tested much at all, but I've read some about it recently because I know a lot of people are particularly interested in the phenomenon of like eye contact over screen, or like this feeling of you guys looking at each other or looking jointly at something. And so a lot of the stuff I've read recently suggests that students really benefit when they feel like sometimes the instructor is looking at them, like looking at the camera, I'm talking to you. And other times it's sort of looking off camera to say like, oh, this thing on the screen, and is using sort of that eye contact as a cue of like, we should look together now at this formula I've written or this diagram that's on the screen.
Interesting. What are some of the favorite things that you've learned as you've gone through this journey of starting to kind of research these topics?
I'd say one of the lessons I have to learn repeatedly is that doing this kind of work is really hard, that studying learning is sort of a messy process because we know that learning is affected by lots of things, and any one experiment might manipulate one aspect of instruction, like is the narrator on screen or off, or are the questions multiple choice or open response? But there are so many other things that affect learning as well. And so I think the biggest lesson I've learned is that it's a messy thing to study, but it's an important thing to study. And when you read research about effective teaching and learning techniques, to sort of take it with a grain of salt that um, translating a research finding to real life practice is hard, right? And just because one study shows an effect doesn't mean this is like globally true, that we need to understand like the circumstances under which some of these recommendations apply. You know, like a perfect example is a lot of the early research on learning from video focused on MOOCs, which are these massive online open enrollment courses. And the research was really about like, well, why is it that so many people drop out and don't finish this? And they did all this research on like the ideal video length and came up with this recommendation that all students lose attention after 4 minutes. So don't make any video that's longer than 4 minutes, which is like, okay, in that context, yes, but let's stop for a second and think about how we go to the movie theater and watch a 3-hour Avengers movie, right? We're totally capable of paying attention for 3 straight hours, right? But the circumstances of that are different. And so I like to caution people, like just because one study says don't make a video that's longer than 4 minutes, doesn't mean that videos longer than 4 minutes are bad, right? We want to understand the situations in which these things are beneficial or harmful to learning.
I would have loved Tony Stark teaching my physics class. I just think that would have been just awesome.
Yeah.
I could have totally done that online. That'd have been great. So in understanding that parents are grappling with just trying to find ways to help their students, their children, in an unpredictable new environment that is regularly changing, that is new to them, new to the teacher, and new to the student. It's not that we haven't used online like FaceTime and stuff, but to have this as a learning environment, I think is an interesting challenge. And I'm wondering, you've done a lot of work on like study habit work, on creating good study habits and what kinds of study habits are options. Like I probably only had one idea of a study habit. Like my whole entire K-20 experience, I probably only studied one way. Never really thought to think that there could be a different way to study. Of course, I had terrible study habits and graduated with like a 2.3 GPA. So maybe I'm not the good reference point here. But if you could share some of the stuff that you've been, talking about with regards to just study habits and how those can, you can change them, adapt them, use new habits. I mean, what are you uncovering?
Yeah. So again, this is the scientist in me who wants to be really careful about saying this isn't my original work, but I'm pretty familiar with it and the people who've generated it. And so I can tell you about it, but I didn't conduct this original research. But here's sort of the gist of it, that students like study habits that feel good, right? That make you feel like I'm getting it and it's making sense. And that often leads them to engage in learning habits that don't benefit long-term learning. So students love to do things like reread the book or reread their notes or highlight things or just sort of like passively absorb the information again. And there's like mounds of evidence that this makes people feel like, oh, I get it, it makes sense. And it's really, really bad for long-term learning because they're not actually practicing what they need to do to use that information later, right? To use information later, you actually have to recall it from your memory and decide whether it applies in the situation you're looking at. And so study habits that really help you develop that long-term learning take advantage of this. So one of these is testing yourself, right? Rather than rereading, you should try to test, what is it that I remember? And testing, I think, is like a word that freaks people out now. It doesn't mean standardized testing. It means effortfully trying to remember stuff. So testing yourself could be using flashcards. Right? You look at a card and you effortfully try to remember the definition of that word. It could mean that you do a free write or a brain dump, where you open up a blank sheet of paper and say, let me write down everything I know about this topic. Right? Just effortfully recalling information strengthens your memory for that information, which is great. The phrase we use here is that retrieval is a memory modifier. Just means remembering stuff makes it stick better. So challenging yourself to do that is good. And sometimes people worry like, well, what about if I make mistakes? Like if I recall something that's wrong, does that mean I'm like strengthening the wrong thing in my mind? And that's actually not true either. That even when we make mistakes, if you have the opportunity to correct them, you remember that information better than if you never made the mistake, which is totally counterintuitive. But I tell students this all the time, that making a mistake and getting feedback leads to better learning than just always seeing the correct answer. Right? So flashcards are perfect for this. You try to remember, you flip it over and you get immediate feedback. A brain dump, you write down everything you remember and then you go back to your notes next and say, okay, what did I miss? What did I get wrong? Right? So testing yourself, making mistakes, spacing out your study. So lots of people want to study for an extended period of time in one sitting. It's actually much better for your memory to study a little bit and then leave a gap of time before you come back to study. And very counterintuitively, the reason this is better is because you forget stuff in that interim. And when you have forgotten stuff, it makes the next study period more valuable to you. Right? It's more effortful to remember, and so that information sticks better. Unfortunately, this makes people feel like, oh, my study method's not working because I'm not remembering anything. But it's actually, we call these things desirable difficulties. Right? They're difficult, they make learning feel harder, but they're desirable because they improve long-term retention. So testing yourself.
This just hurt my brain. Like everything you just said is so against
I know.
what I feel is
Right.
and you said it right at the beginning, like this is you feel good about it. And so yes, like I feel good about going back over and like, oh man, look at that, I nailed it, and never even thought of that. It is such a, literally everything you said like is counterintuitive to what my brain says is how you should do it.
Right. But what you want to think about is making your study sessions approximate the way you're going to need to use that information, right? So if you know that you have a test coming up that's a closed book test where you're going to have to like write an essay response, well, then practice that skill, right? Of writing out everything that you know and then checking what you missed, right? If you know that you're going to have to solve problems on a math test, well, practice doing that and making mistakes and then checking your answers instead of only like looking for the answer and then trying to do the problem solving to get it, right? Another one I didn't mention is to interleave topics. So this is especially true in stuff like math learning, where often you teach like one topic at a time, like we're gonna add fractions today and we're gonna subtract fractions tomorrow, we're gonna multiply fractions on the next day. And if you only ever practice in that way, students learn like, oh, well, I know how to add the fractions and that's what I'm supposed to do here because that's what we're doing today, right? And so they don't ever have to make a choice about like, well, what's the right procedure to apply to this problem, right? It's sort of like baked into the way that we're studying. And a more effective way to study would be to mix up all these problem types together, right? So you have an addition and then a subtraction and multiplication and division. They're just all mixed together so that every time you come to a new problem, part of solving the problem is deciding what's the method I use to solve this one, right? And that's a great study technique because that's what you have to do on the exam. So often we have students in math or in statistics who feel like, well, I knew how to do the problems on the homework, but on the exam, I didn't know which approach to use, right? And
Yeah.
so these good study habits are all about trying to think, how am I going to need to access this information later? And can I practice that while I'm studying?
So I was a fortunate student who was good at math. Like it just came naturally to me, and I memorized the step, right? Like I just knew, oh, if I'm doing this now, this is how I have to do that. It sounds like what you're talking about is a little bit deeper way to process and work on math, which is to more recall the method you should be using. And I missed the word that you were using there about like when I come to a problem, I want my brain to be thinking about not just, oh, recall the rote memory of do this, but recall the process that I should be applying
Right.
to do it.
Right. Because
Is
what
that
we've
accurate to
seen,
say like that's the difference?
yeah, I mean, I think I'm not trying to suggest like don't recall the steps of how to do it, but include as part of the problem solving process, understanding like which method I should use. And we've seen this like be an issue for many students. So when I was a graduate student, my advisor was doing some work with community college students and looking at performance on a math placement test. And the most common kind of error on a math placement test is people just calculate something without thinking about what the question is really asking them for, right? And so we see this a lot where people have just memorized procedures, but they have never stopped to think about when would I use this procedure and why, right? And to develop really good understanding and long-term learning, we need that to be a piece of the learning process.
Yeah, and when you and I talked before, leading up to this interview, we started talking about math, and I remember you were like, oh well, this you could get to the same answer in a different route, and I was like, not everybody does that. Like it just like kind of blew my mind, and so I was like, okay, well maybe you could share with the audience and those folks that will be reading later, some of the conversation around. Because I find Common Core to be confusing at first. I was like, why are we doing math this way? This doesn't make any sense to me. But the way you describe it makes so much more sense that I was like, how come nobody's talking about this? Like people need to be talking about the why we're doing it Common Core, as opposed to, no, this is just the way that we do it now.
Yeah.
Which is commonly the answer. And that's not satisfying.
Yeah. So I think people get frustrated by Common Core because it doesn't make sense to them initially. And I think my response to this is a lot of the math instruction that we got also was taught in such a way that there wasn't an effort to make it make sense, right? If you think about, so the conversation we had was about multiplying 2-digit numbers, right? And why is it that we do it this way? So I'll talk through an example. You're multiplying 2-digit numbers like say 27 by 13. Okay. And if you're using this algorithm that most of us were taught, you say, oh, okay, so you do the 3 and the 7 times each other first, right? And then you do the 3 times the 2 for the 20. And then in the next row, you put a 0 first, and then you do the 1 times the 7 and the 2. And it's not necessarily explained very clearly, why do you put a 0, right? A lot of us just sort of memorize, oh, this is what you're supposed to do. To do it right, you have to do it this way. right? And there isn't much explanation about the fact that, well, the reason you would put a 0 there is because you're actually not multiplying by 1 in that row, you're multiplying by 10, right? And understanding something about place value. And part of what Common Core is trying to do is give that deeper understanding about, like, not just teaching kids like memorize that you put a 0 in the second row and 2 zeros in the third row and 3 zeros in the fourth row, but why you would do that, right? And it's because you're multiplying by tens or hundreds or thousands. And the same thing with some of these like algorithms for adding and subtracting. They're really trying to give some kids a sense of number and how number works, right? And for all the folks who feel like this is too complicated, like it's so much easier the way I learned it, my response would be, we see so many adults who demonstrate a lack of understanding, right? They might memorize a procedure, but if you memorize a step wrong and you don't understand what the procedure is supposed to accomplish, you won't catch your mistake, right? And it breaks my heart sometimes to encounter these students who've just never had somebody explain to them like how place value works, and suddenly things click. So I hope that captured what we covered.
It does. You know, and we talked about the process, like, you know, if you were to just offhandedly, and so your example was 13 times 27, right? And so, you know, in my brain, I would just drop the 3 on the 13, multiply 10 times 27, get 270, and multiply 3 times 25, which is going to give me 75, add that, and then add another 3 times 2, which is 6. You know, so I would have just gone through a completely non-written out format in my brain. My brain doesn't solve it by going through the equation in my head.
But what you're describing is essentially what Common Core is trying to teach, is that kind of reasoning about number, right? To be able to say to yourself that, oh, 27 is actually the same thing as 25 and 2, and I could multiply these things separately to get those values. That's sort of the goal of Common Core, is to develop that reasoning about number.
That might have just solved millions of parents' problems.
I don't think it will.
Common Core. You wait until we get the comments about this. I am so excited. I know you're very,
it's worth saying
you're humble, but nobody talks about this stuff.
I just think it's worth saying that, like, as an adult, if you're struggling to understand Common Core, it might be because your education didn't actually provide you with a very deep understanding of math, right? Like, agreed that it's probably confusing to anybody who's seeing it for the first time, but if it doesn't immediately make sense, like, part of that might be, well, you learned an algorithm and it was never explained to you why you do it this way. You know, like, there's a saying that I think is kind of hilarious but sad when people learn fraction division, which is, ours is not to question why, just to flip and multiply. And it's just sort of like indicative of this attitude of like, it doesn't matter why you do it, you just have to do it this way.
Yeah, that is powerful. Talk to us a little bit about your Lime Lab and what work you do there, and what projects are you working on right now?
Yeah, so in that lab, I'm trying to decide what level of detail to start at. The question that motivates me, I'm gonna mess with this curtain for a second. The question that really motivates me is, how do students develop understanding about complex material in math and science rather than just memorization? And I started studying video, not because I was specifically interested in video learning, but because it's a tool for studying instruction very carefully. Like in an experimental design where you want to change just one thing across different versions of a lesson, if you're giving a live lesson, that's really hard to do, because like repeating myself in exactly the same way with the same mannerisms and gestures and all that, it's hard. But if you do it in a video, you can change really small things to see if they make a difference in what people learn. And so that was the motivation for how I got into this area. And the specific projects we're working on now have a lot to do with effective design of multimedia instruction and the use of questions to help people learn. So we've got more projects going on than I can describe in the time that we've got. But one of the big ones we're doing now is investigating the use of questions in pre-recorded video lecture. So I'm teaching a cognitive psychology course right now where I pre-record, a 30-minute lecture, and we make different versions of this where some students get multiple choice questions and others get open response, and some people get a control video with no questions. And so we randomly assign students to these versions, and they take the same quiz at the end, and we just compare, did people learn better in one of these versions than another? And does it depend on other factors like how much prior knowledge they had about the material, for example.
Yeah, it makes me think about parents who are in a homeschooling environment are probably more likely to do regular knowledge checks as progress proceeds, just because of the nature of the environment. Parents who are in an environment where their students are sitting in front of a Zoom screen and that student's absorbing their learning via a teacher to a class of 20 or 30 or however many. One thing they may consider adding into the mix, if available, is doing some knowledge checks during the day with your child, where the teacher, just in the sheer management of the Zoom course, may not have the bandwidth to do
Yeah.
so. And it's
So
not that every
actually,
teacher's not, but it's just like there's an opportunity there for maybe a parent to help.
yeah, there's actually another study we're doing that's kind of relevant to this idea, that's taking advantage of something called the self-explanation effect, which shows that if you just prompt students to explain things to themselves as they go, that they learn more than if they don't, are just sort of passively listening. And so we're investigating the effectiveness of that, and also the context of doing something called refutation. So students have misconceptions about all kinds of things, and it's actually quite hard to change some of their misconceptions, but it helps when you explicitly refute them. So an example in a study we use is teaching students about the cause of the seasons. Many people have a misconception that seasons are caused by the distance to the sun. They say, well, when we're closer to the sun, that's when it's summer, and when we're farther away from the sun, that's when it's winter. And that's actually not true, because in January, when it's winter in the Northern Hemisphere, we are at our closest point to the sun. And some people think, oh, well, but it's about tipping towards the sun, and that's what makes you closer. And it is about being tilted towards the sun, but it's not about being close. It's about the angle of the sunlight and how many hours of sunlight we have in the day. So in this study, we have some students see a version of this lesson where we just explain, like, oh, the seasons are caused by the axis tilt and the angle of the sunlight, etc. And other students get this explicit misconception at the beginning that says, a really common wrong idea is about distance to the sun, and here's why that's wrong. And then they get the explanation about axis tilt and angle. And students learn much more effectively when you explicitly talk about those misconceptions and why they're wrong. And so the study we're doing right now, how I got started on this, is trying to combine the explicit refutation with self-explanation to see if we can get, like, extra bang for our buck.
Yeah, that's awesome. That makes, I mean, I hadn't really occurred to me that would be a better way to teach that. But when you explain it, I think about, I kind of chuckle in my brain, because at one point in time, I also believed that it was proximity to the sun that did it. And it wasn't until later on in my science career that or science exploration in life, that I discovered, oh, it's the tilt, not the actual physical distance of the Earth to the sun as we go around in our non-circular orbit. Awesome. All right, one last question before we open it up to the audience, and that is, what book are you reading right now? Do you have time to read books? Are you?
No, I don't have time to read books, which is sad, because I used to read every night before bed, and lately I've just been totally wiped out from teaching. I guess technically I am in the middle of reading How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Oh, interesting.
That's next to my bed, but I also just purchased the winner of the Hugo Award. It's a book called A Memory Called Empire.
Okay.
So it's the Hugo Award is for science fiction writing.
Yeah, no, I'm a fan. I'm a science fiction nerd myself.
Cool.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for all that insightful information. I've got probably 3 articles worth of stuff in here. I'm going to have to pare this down a little bit, but that was incredibly insightful. I wanted to open it up to anybody who's here joining. If you have any questions, now would be the time to ask. If you don't, that's okay too. But I just always like to give an opportunity for folks to go ahead and ask a question if they feel that they have something they want to see if we can find an answer for, or at least highlight something.
I have a quick question for you. Thank you. That was very informative, and how pertinent right now too, just to the current times and how our lives are transitioning, and especially children and learners of all ages transitioning to the video environment and learning in a different capacity. Is there anything that you've come across in your research or your experience of what you've seen that applies to individuals with disabilities in how they're learning and how this information is being translated and interpreted via the video platform? And is there any room for improvements from your immediate perspective on ways to have a more impact of this type of learning delivery in that world.
Sure. So do you have particular disabilities in mind?
Yes, so just for context, I work at an agency that specializes in developing kind of life curriculum programs for adults with disabilities, and typically they're individuals with intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities. And the majority of the clients that we serve are somewhere on the autism spectrum, as well as some genetic conditions like Down syndrome, and cerebral palsy, specific learning disabilities, and non-specific learning disabilities.
Got it. Yeah, the only reason I asked is because I wanted to make sure if we were talking about sort of intellectual delays, or if we were talking about like blind or hearing loss type of disabilities. So I don't specifically study those populations and how they might respond differently to teaching and learning. But I do think some of the things that work in non-disabled populations are, I believe that they are generally true, which is that learning is served by making sense of stuff, right? And like in contrast to memorizing, and making sense can take lots of different forms, right? I talked about self-explanation as a tool for helping students to make sense of what they're reading or watching. But making sense sometimes also means finding connections between your experiences and what you're learning. And so taking time to focus on how does this make sense? How is it connected to things that you already know? Can you explain it back to me? Those are the kinds of teaching activities that I think are going to be beneficial for anybody at any stage. Like asking, you know, a second grader, explain the subtraction problem to me. Like, how does that work, right? Is just as valuable a tool as explaining or asking a college student to say, can you explain to me, like, you know, what is a sampling distribution and how is that different from like a population or a particular sample we're looking at? It's
Right.
sort of like a general purpose tool.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I was thinking to some of the stuff that you said earlier about having them try to explain it in their own way and try to explain what it is that they do understand about it as a mechanism, and as well like brain dumping. Like just taking a piece of paper and just writing down everything that you believe has been learned, whether right or wrong. We got to get away from right or wrong, and we got to start thinking about just the interaction between content and the value that I now know is you can write stuff down that's wrong, and it still is helping your brain make those proper connections for later on recall. Is probably, Miles, I think something that would be a good tool, if not already being used in your organization. By the way, I love what you all do. Nancy Batterman sat on the board of my nonprofit that we used to run. So very familiar with your program there, and you guys do a lot of really good work. So hats off to you folks. Thank you for all the effort that you put in.
Oh, thank you.
And if I could add one more thought to this question as well. So self-explanation, or that kind of prompt, I think is really useful for getting students to do the active construction that's needed for learning. But as instructors, we can also sort of use a general purpose approach of thinking about what kind of information am I asking the student to process right now, right? Am I asking them to simultaneously look at something and listen to me? And is that overwhelming their capability, right? So always keeping in mind the student's limited capacity to look at things and listen at the same time, right? You probably know that it is impossible to read something and listen to somebody else at the same time. And so keeping that in mind when you're giving students like a worksheet to do, right? I think about this all the time, that if I want them to be listening to me, I can't show them the worksheet until after I have finished speaking, right? Or if I want them to understand a diagram really well, that I don't want them to be trying to read something at the same time that I'm explaining and wanting them to look at part of the diagram. So I think understanding processing constraints on the human mind is like also a general purpose approach to improving instruction.
That's very solid. That reminds me of that trick that they used to give you, and I think it's usually in grade school, where they would give you a list of tasks that you're supposed to do, like draw a square, draw a triangle, draw a line, write your name, and then the teacher just keeps talking in the background, and then at the end it's like, go back and only do step number 1, you know, and like you're already done doing 15 steps later, and they're like, surprise, you're only supposed to do step number 1, and it's because your brain just can't do multitask that way.
Well, and if you're asking students to make all of those decisions in the moment about, should I be listening, should I be reading, like, what's going on, they're going to make decisions that you don't have any control over. So if you really want to structure learning effectively, you want to keep in mind, like, how much am I asking them to do in any given moment?
That's solid, super solid. Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Awesome. Thank you again so much. This was super, super informative, and I'm so glad that you took the time. I really appreciate it. Sorry about the technical hiccups. Glad we got it figured out. And it just was a real pleasure to get to just kind of learn from you and just hear some insights as to some of the things that you've been working on, and some of the things that you've read, and some of the things that you've do with your students in your environment. I found that to be incredibly useful. And while some of this knowledge may be common to you, I think it was just excellent shares for myself as a parent and our audience. It was great. So just thank you. This was wonderful. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And if you need me to clarify or expand on anything, just let me know.